Dr. Emily Watson pressed her face against the cold glass of the observation deck, watching the forest line with growing unease. Something was moving out there in the thick green shadows, something big enough to make the tall trees sway without any wind. The other researchers had already noticed it too. Michael Thompson was adjusting his scanner settings while Dr. Robert Hayes fumbled with his binoculars. "There," Robert whispered, pointing toward a gap in the trees. "Do you see it?" Emily did see it, and her breath caught in her throat. The creature that emerged from the forest was unlike any shadowmoor they had ever recorded. Most of the predators they had studied were about the size of earth tigers, dangerous enough to keep the human colonists safely behind their energy barriers. But this one was different. This one was massive. The beast stood nearly 12 feet at the shoulder, its dark fur rippling with muscles that spoke of incredible power. Its amber eyes seemed to glow in the afternoon light as it surveyed the human settlement with an intelligence that made Emily's skin crawl. The colonists had named these creatures shadowmoors because of their ability to appear and disappear like ghosts in the forest, but there was nothing ghostly about this enormous alpha. "Sweet mother of..." Michael started to say, then caught himself. Even through the safety of the observation deck, the creature's presence felt overwhelming. Colony Administrator James Miller burst through the door behind them, his face red with alarm. "What's the situation?" "The perimeter sensors are going crazy." "Alpha shadowmoor," Emily said simply. "Bigger than anything in our files." James pushed past them to get a look, and his face went pale. "That thing could tear through our barriers like tissue paper. Why isn't it attacking?" That was exactly what Emily had been wondering. In their 3 years on this world, every shadowmoor encounter had followed the same pattern. The creatures would test the barriers, probe for weaknesses, sometimes even attempt coordinated attacks on the outer defenses. But they always kept their distance, respecting the invisible line that separated human territory from the wild lands beyond. This giant was different. It walked with slow, deliberate steps toward their settlement, showing no fear of the energy barriers that had kept its smaller cousins at bay. But it also showed no aggression. Its massive head was held high, alert but not threatening. Its tail, thick as a tree trunk, swayed gently rather than lashing with predatory intent. "Should I activate the defense grid?" asked William Barnes, the security chief, as he joined them at the window. "Wait," Emily said, raising her hand. Something about the creature's behavior struck her as purposeful rather than hostile. "Let's see what it does." The giant shadowmoor reached the outer edge of their territory and stopped. For several long minutes, it simply stood there, studying the human buildings with those intelligent amber eyes. Emily could almost feel it thinking, evaluating, making some kind of decision. Then the creature did something that made everyone in the observation deck gasp in surprise. It carefully lowered its massive head and placed something on the ground just outside their barrier. Then it backed away slowly, never taking its eyes off the human settlement. "What did it just do?" James asked, his voice tight with confusion. Michael was already adjusting his telescope for a better view. "I can see them," he said after a moment. "Two small forms. They're not moving much." "Cubs," Emily breathed, understanding flooding through her. It left cubs. Through the powerful lens of the telescope, the scene became heartbreakingly clear. Two young shadowmoors, barely the size of house cats, lay motionless on the grass. Even from this distance, Emily could see they were in poor condition. One appeared to have a deep wound across its side, while the other seemed unable to move its back legs properly. The giant alpha had retreated to a ridge about half a mile away, where it settled down in a position that gave it a clear view of both its abandoned young and the human settlement. Its posture was patient, watchful, waiting. "This doesn't make sense," William muttered. "Predators don't abandon their young. Especially not shadowmoors. Everything we know about them suggests they're extremely protective parents." But Emily was beginning to understand something that chilled her more than any direct attack would have. This wasn't abandonment. This was something far more sophisticated and far more dangerous. "It's a test," she said quietly. "What?" James turned to stare at her. "Look at it," Emily pointed toward the ridge where the massive creature waited. "It's not leaving. It's watching. It wants to see what we do with its cubs." The implications hit everyone at once. This wasn't just a random encounter with a wild animal. This was a deliberate action by a creature intelligent enough to understand human nature, intelligent enough to set up a situation that would reveal something about human character. "Those cubs are dying," Robert observed grimly, studying them through his own binoculars. "They're injured and probably haven't eaten in days. If we don't help them soon, they won't survive. And if we do help them, we're interfering with a wild predator's offspring," James countered. We don't know what that thing expects from us, but I'm not about to risk this entire colony on a guess. Emily continued to watch the patient figure on the ridge. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew that this moment would define everything that followed. The giant shadow maw had presented them with a choice, and somehow she understood that both species' futures might depend on the decision they made in the next few hours. The cubs were still alive, but time was running out. The colony's medical bay had never been used for anything like this before. Emily knelt beside the makeshift bed they had created from blankets and cushions, carefully cleaning the deep wound on the smaller cub's side. The young shadowmaw's breathing was shallow but steady, and its amber eyes followed her every movement with startling awareness. "Hand me the antibiotics," she whispered to Robert, who was working on the second cub's injured leg. They had waited until the middle of the night to bring the cubs inside, sneaking past the security checkpoints while James Miller slept peacefully in his quarters. "This is insane," Michael muttered from his position by the door, watching for any signs of discovery. "If Miller finds out what we're doing, he'll have us on the next transport ship back to Earth." "Then we don't let him find out," Emily replied, applying a gentle pressure bandage to the cub's wound. The young creature made a soft sound that was almost like a purr, and she felt her heart skip a beat. Everything they had been taught about shadow maws suggested they were nothing more than dangerous predators, but this little one seemed more like a frightened child than a monster. Dr. Anna Clark arrived 20 minutes later with supplies from the xenobiology lab. She had been studying shadow maw behavior patterns for 2 years, but she had never been this close to a living specimen. "They are so much smaller than I expected," she said softly, kneeling beside the cubs. "They are probably only a few months old," Robert explained, checking the second cub's temperature with a handheld scanner. "This one has a broken leg, but it should heal properly with the right care." Over the following days, the small team developed a routine. They would take turns visiting the cubs during their regular work shifts, bringing food and medicine while maintaining the pretense of normal research activities. Emily had named the smaller, more injured cub Scout because of the way it constantly looked around, taking in everything with curious eyes. The larger one became brave after it tried to protect Scout during their first medical examination. What amazed Emily most was how quickly the cubs adapted to human presence. Within a week, they were eating from her hand and allowing her to handle them without fear. Scout would make soft chirping sounds whenever she entered the room, while Brave would actually wag its tail like an earth dog. "Look at this," Anna said excitedly during one of their secret meetings. She had been recording the cubs' vocalizations and studying the patterns. "They're not just making random sounds. There's structure here, complexity. I think they're trying to communicate with us." The breakthrough came during the second week. Emily was feeding Scout when the cub suddenly looked up at her and made a sound that was clearly an attempt to mimic human speech. It was rough and unclear, but it sounded almost like Emily. "Did you hear that?" Emily gasped, nearly dropping the food container. Robert and Anna rushed over, both staring at the small creature in amazement. Scout looked up at them with bright eyes and repeated the sound, this time more clearly. "Emily." "It's trying to say your name," Anna whispered. "These creatures are learning our language." From that moment on, their understanding of shadow maw intelligence changed completely. Both cubs began showing behaviors that went far beyond simple animal responses. They learned to operate simple mechanisms, like the automatic door controls and food dispensers. They recognized each team member individually and responded differently to each person. Most remarkably, they began solving problems. When Emily accidentally dropped her data pad behind a heavy equipment cabinet, Scout studied the situation for several minutes before using a long metal tool to hook the device and pull it within reach. Brave figured out how to stack containers to reach higher shelves, and both cubs learned to work together to accomplish tasks that would have been impossible for either one alone. "They're not just intelligent," Robert observed during one of their evening sessions. "They're creative. They're planning ahead and making decisions based on complex reasoning." Meanwhile, outside the colony, the giant Alpha remained on its ridge. Every morning, Emily would check the observation deck and see the massive creature still there, still watching. It never approached the settlement, but it never left either. Sometimes she thought she could feel its eyes on her even through the walls of the medical bay. The cubs were growing stronger every day. Scout's wound had healed completely, leaving only a thin scar beneath its dark fur. Brave's leg had mended well, and the young creature could run and jump with surprising agility. They had both grown significantly in size, now about as large as medium-sized earth dogs. But with their physical recovery came new challenges. The cubs were becoming more active and harder to hide. They wanted to explore beyond the small room where they had been recovering, and keeping them secret was becoming nearly impossible. Emily knew they were running out of time. Soon, someone would discover what they had been doing. When that happened, she wasn't sure what James Miller would do. She also wasn't sure what the giant alpha on the ridge would do if it thought humans were harming its young. Every day that passed brought them closer to a moment of truth that none of them were prepared for. The cubs had become more than just research subjects or rescued animals. They had become individuals with distinct personalities, creatures capable of affection and trust. The thought of losing them now filled Emily with a sadness she hadn't expected. But outside on the ridge, the giant alpha waited patiently, and Emily knew that eventually, all secrets would be revealed. Tommy Peterson was 8 years old and had never been told he couldn't do something without immediately wanting to do it anyway. When his parents warned him about staying away from the forest edge, when the teachers told him the outer areas were dangerous, when the security guards explained about the barriers, Tommy just nodded and smiled and thought about adventure. That bright Tuesday morning, he was playing hide-and-seek with his friends in the colony's central courtyard. The game had been going on for an hour, and Tommy was getting bored with the same hiding spots everyone always used. He needed somewhere new, somewhere clever, somewhere that would make him the best hide-and-seek player in the entire colony. That's when he noticed the pretty flowers growing near the fence line. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, with petals that shifted colors like rainbows and stems that seemed to glow in the morning sunlight. They were beautiful and mysterious, and they were growing just beyond the inner safety zone where children were supposed to stay. Tommy looked around carefully. His friends were still searching for him in the playground equipment on the other side of the courtyard. The adults were all busy with their morning work routines. Nobody was watching the fence line. He slipped through a gap in the inner barrier that was meant for maintenance workers, his heart racing with excitement. The flowers were even more beautiful up close, and they smelled like candy and sunshine. Tommy reached out to touch one of the rainbow petals. The moment his fingers made contact, the flower released a cloud of golden dust that sparkled in the air around him. Tommy laughed and reached for another flower, then another. Soon he was surrounded by a shimmering cloud of the beautiful sparkles, dancing through them like they were fairy dust. But within minutes, Tommy began to feel strange. His head started spinning, and his throat felt scratchy. The pretty sparkles suddenly didn't seem so magical anymore. They were making it hard to breathe, and his eyes were watering so much he could barely see. Tommy tried to call for help, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. He tried to run back toward the safe area, but his legs felt weak and shaky. The golden dust was still swirling around him, and every breath he took made him feel worse. He stumbled and fell to his knees just as everything started to go dark around the edges. That's when Scout appeared. The young Shadowmoor had grown considerably over the past few months of secret care. Now nearly the size of a large earth wolf, Scout was strong and fast and more intelligent than any animal Tommy had ever imagined. The cub had been resting in the hidden room where Emily's team kept both Shadowmoors when it heard Tommy's distressed breathing through the ventilation system. Without hesitation, Scout had found a way out of the medical bay and raced toward the source of the sound. The young Shadowmoor reached Tommy just as the boy collapsed completely. Scout immediately understood the danger. The creature had been born in these forests and knew instinctively that the golden dust from the flowers was deadly to most living things. But Scout also knew what to do. Using its own body as a shield, Scout covered Tommy completely, protecting the boy from breathing any more of the toxic spores. Then the cub began making loud, urgent calls that echoed across the entire colony. David Peterson was in his workshop when he heard the strange sounds. At first he thought it might be some kind of machinery malfunction, but something about the rhythm and urgency of the calls made him drop his tools and run toward the noise. What he found when he reached the fence line made him stop dead in his tracks. A Shadowmoor cub was crouched protectively over his son, its body forming a living tent that kept the swirling golden dust away from Tommy's face. The creature was making continuous calls for help while using one paw to gently shake the unconscious boy. "Tommy!" David shouted, starting to run forward. But Scout looked up at him with intelligent amber eyes and made a sharp warning sound. The cub carefully moved to show David the cloud of deadly spores still hanging in the air, then positioned itself between the boy and his father to make its message clear. Coming closer would only put David in danger too. Instead, Scout began a careful process of dragging Tommy away from the contaminated area, moving slowly to avoid stirring up more of the toxic dust. Only when they had reached completely clean air did the cub step back and allow David to gather his son into his arms. By then, half the colony had heard Scout's calls and come running. They arrived to find David Peterson cradling his unconscious son while a young Shadowmoor sat nearby, watching with concerned eyes as the colony's medical team worked to help Tommy breathe normally again. Margaret Peterson fell to her knees beside her husband and son, tears streaming down her face as the medical scanner showed that Tommy would recover completely. Then she looked up at Scout, who was still sitting patiently nearby, and her expression changed to wonder. "That creature saved him," she whispered. "It saved Tommy's life." Word spread through the colony like wildfire. Within hours, everyone knew that Dr. Watson's team had been secretly caring for Shadowmoor cubs, and that one of those cubs had risked its own safety to protect a human child. James Miller called an emergency meeting for that evening, his face grim with anger and confusion. But when he looked around the packed meeting hall, he saw something unexpected in the faces of his fellow colonists. Instead of fear or anger, he saw curiosity, gratitude, and something that looked almost like hope. The emergency alarm echoed through Haven's Rest at 4 a.m, jolting every colonist from sleep. Emily rushed to the command center still in her pajamas, finding James Miller staring at a wall of flashing red sensors with an expression of pure terror on his face. 27 Shadowmoors moving toward Bear Creek, he said without looking up from the displays. The mining outpost has 12 people and minimal defenses. They won't survive if those creatures reach them. Security Chief William Barnes was already suiting up in combat gear, his face set in grim determination. "I'm taking a team to evacuate the miners. We can have them back here within 6 hours if we move fast." But Emily was studying the sensor patterns, and something didn't make sense. She had spent months learning about Shadowmoor behavior, first through research and then through direct contact with Scout and Brave. "Wait," she said, pointing at the screen. "Look at their formation." "What about it?" James snapped, clearly in no mood for academic discussions. "They're not moving like hunters," Emily insisted. "When Shadowmoors hunt, they spread out, they use cover, they try to surround their prey. These ones are traveling together in a tight group. They're not hunting anything." William paused in checking his weapon. "Then what are they doing?" Before Emily could answer, a new alarm began sounding. This one was different, closer. The proximity sensors around Haven's Rest itself were detecting movement. "Multiple contacts," reported the night watch officer, his voice shaking. "Dozens of them, coming from all directions." Through the command center's windows, they could see shadows moving at the edge of the forest. Large shapes that materialized and vanished like ghosts in the pre-dawn darkness. But these creatures weren't attacking either. They were simply positioning themselves around the colony at a respectful distance, as if they were waiting for something. "This is impossible," James whispered. "Shadowmoors don't coordinate like this. They're not pack animals on this scale." Emily felt a cold realization washing over her. "It's Scout and Brave," she said quietly. "What?" "The cubs. Something's wrong with them." She ran toward the medical bay where they had been keeping the young Shadowmoors, with James and William close behind. When they reached the secure room, they found both cubs in obvious distress. Scout was pacing back and forth, making low whining sounds, while Brave was pressed against the far wall with his ears flattened against his head. "They're terrified," Emily observed. "But not of us. They're afraid of something else." That's when Anna Clark burst through the door, her tablet computer clutched in her hands. "I've been monitoring their vocalizations all night," she said breathlessly. "They've been calling out for hours, but not in any pattern I've recorded before. These are distress calls, and they're being broadcast on frequencies that carry for miles." The pieces suddenly clicked together in Emily's mind. "They're calling for help," she said. "And every Shadowmoor in the region is responding." James stared at her in disbelief. "You're saying that all those creatures out there are here because of 2 cubs?" "Not just because of them," Emily corrected. "Because of us. The cubs are afraid that we're going to hurt them or separate them from us. They've bonded with us, but they don't understand human politics or colony security. All they know is that something has changed, and they're scared." William was already on his radio, calling for a full defensive alert. "I want every barrier at maximum power and all security teams at their posts." But Emily grabbed his arm. "That's exactly the wrong thing to do. If we act like we're preparing for war, we'll prove to them that humans really are dangerous." "Those creatures could overrun our defenses in minutes," William protested. "They could have done that already," Emily pointed out. "But they haven't. They're not here to attack us. They're here to protect Scout and Brave." As if to prove her point, Scout suddenly looked up and made a sound that was clearly an attempt at human speech. "Emily," the cub said, reaching toward her with obvious desperation. Anna was studying her tablet frantically. "The calls are intensifying," she reported. "And I'm picking up responses from the creatures outside. It's like they're having a conversation." Through the windows, they could see that the giant alpha from the ridge had finally moved. The massive creature was approaching the colony's main gate, moving with slow, purposeful steps. Its amber eyes reflected the emergency lights, giving it an almost supernatural appearance in the darkness. "That's it," James declared. "I'm ordering the immediate removal of both cubs. We'll transport them far away from the colony and release them in the wilderness." "No," Emily said sharply. "You can't separate them from us now. They trust us. If we betray that trust, we'll prove everything the adult Shadowmoors suspect about humans." But James had already made his decision. He called for a containment team to secure the cubs for transport. Within minutes, armed security personnel were entering the medical bay with capture equipment. Scout and Brave immediately understood that something terrible was happening. Their distress calls became louder and more urgent, carrying across the settlement and into the forest beyond. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every Shadowmoor within miles began moving toward Haven's Rest, their combined voices creating a chorus that seemed to shake the very ground beneath the colony. But they still didn't attack. They simply drew closer, forming an enormous circle around the human settlement. And from the main gate, the giant alpha finally crossed the barrier line and began walking directly toward the colony center, its massive form silhouetted against the emergency lights like something from humanity's oldest nightmares. The massive alpha Shadowmoor stopped just 20 feet from the colony's main building, its amber eyes fixed on the humans who had gathered in the courtyard. Emily had never seen anything so terrifying and magnificent at the same time. The creature stood perfectly still, waiting, as if it understood that one wrong move from either side could destroy everything. Scout and Brave had been brought outside in their transport cages, both cubs crying out with sounds that broke Emily's heart. The moment they saw the giant alpha, their distress calls changed to something else entirely. Emily couldn't understand the complex sounds they were making, but Anna was frantically recording everything on her tablet. "They're talking," Anna whispered in amazement. "The cubs are actually having a conversation with that creature." James Miller stood with his security team, weapons drawn but not aimed. His face was pale with fear and confusion. "What does it want?" he asked through gritted teeth. Emily made a decision that would either save them all or get everyone killed. She stepped forward, moving slowly toward the cages where Scout and Brave were being held. The giant alpha's eyes tracked her movement, but it made no threatening gestures. "Let them out," she said quietly. "Absolutely not," William Barnes replied. "Those cubs are the only thing keeping that monster from attacking us." "No," Emily said, understanding flooding through her voice. "They're the only thing preventing us from communicating." She reached for the release mechanism on Scout's cage. The small Shadowmoor immediately rushed to her side, pressing against her legs while making soft sounds of relief. Brave joined them a moment later, and both cubs positioned themselves between Emily and the giant alpha. Then something extraordinary happened. The giant alpha began making a series of low, rumbling sounds that were clearly directed at Scout and Brave. The cubs responded with their own vocalizations, then turned to Emily and began making the human-like sounds they had learned during their recovery. "Emily," Scout said clearly, then pointed toward the giant alpha with one paw. The cub made more sounds, mixing Shadowmoor calls with attempted human words. "Friend," Brave added, having learned that word from Robert during their medical sessions. "Friend, Emily." Anna was staring at her tablet screen in disbelief. "They're translating," she said. "The cubs are actually translating between us and that creature." Emily felt her heart racing as she realized what was happening. She looked up at the giant alpha and spoke slowly and clearly. "We helped your cubs. We made them healthy again." Scout and Brave immediately began making sounds to the alpha, their voices mixing human words with Shadowmoor calls. The giant creature listened intently, then responded with its own complex vocalizations. The cubs turned back to Emily, and Scout made sounds that she had never heard before. But somehow, she understood the meaning. The giant alpha was grateful, but there was more it needed to communicate. Anna had been studying Shadowmoor behavior for years, and she stepped forward carefully. "I think it's trying to tell us something important," she said. "Something about why all these creatures have gathered here." Through the cubs' remarkable translation abilities, a story began to emerge that changed everything the humans thought they knew about this world. The Shadowmoors had been watching human colonists for 3 years, studying their behavior and waiting to determine if humanity could be trusted. The giant alpha, who the Shadowmoors called Great Father, had deliberately left his cubs as a test. He wanted to see if humans would show compassion to helpless young ones, even when those young ones belonged to their natural enemies. Emily's decision to care for Scout and Brave had proven that humans were capable of kindness across species lines. But now Great Father had an even more important message to share. The ground beneath their feet had been changing. Deep underground, pressure was building that would soon result in massive earthquakes and volcanic activity. The Shadowmoor's sensitive hearing had detected these changes months ago, and they knew that both species would need to work together to survive what was coming. Through Scout's and Brave's patient translation, Great Father explained that the Shadowmoors knew of safe places in the mountains where the ground was stable. But reaching these places would require human technology and Shadowmoor knowledge of the terrain. He's asking for an alliance, Emily said, her voice filled with wonder. They want to help each other survive. James Miller had been listening to the entire exchange with growing amazement. The colony administrator looked around at his fellow humans, then at the dozens of Shadowmoors waiting patiently at the forest edge. All his assumptions about these creatures had been shattered in a single morning. "What do we need to do?" he asked quietly. Over the following weeks, Haven's Rest became something unprecedented in human history. Construction teams worked alongside Shadowmoor packs to build earthquake-resistant shelters. Human engineers learned to follow Shadowmoor scouts through mountain passages that no human had ever seen. Children played games with young Shadowmoors while their parents planned evacuation routes together. Scout and Brave became the first official ambassadors between the two species. They had learned enough human language to communicate basic concepts, while also teaching selected humans to understand Shadowmoor calls. When the predicted seismic events began 6 months later, the integrated community was ready. Humans and Shadowmoors evacuated together to the mountain safe zones, sharing resources and protecting each other's young during the dangerous journey. Emily often watched Scout and Brave leading groups of mixed human and Shadowmoor children in their daily activities, and she marveled at how much had changed. What had begun as a simple act of compassion toward 2 injured cubs had grown into something that ensured both species would thrive on their shared world. The test had been passed, and the result truly had changed everything.